I wanted to set that up to show that it wasn't just the CIA that was doing it. It was cops. Local law enforcement were also selling and creating crack cocaine. All right, get ready for it, folks, because this one was big. Dirty cops are everywhere. They've been around for quite some time. And there is honestly some new revelations that are coming out in South Florida that we're going to be talking about in this subject, in this segment. But one of the things I want to start off with is the war on drugs. The war on drugs was a war that was started by Richard Nixon, former president of the United States, in the 1970s. And this war on drugs had a specific objective. I want to get into that first before we get into this story, because this lays the groundwork for what is going on right now. So let me share this. 13, the prejudice of the Nixon drug policy. And I'll see you guys on either side.
We have launched an all-out offensive against crime, against narcotics, against permissiveness in our country.
The rhetoric of get tough and law and order was part and parcel of the backlash of the civil rights movement.
Nixon administration official has admitted that the war on drugs is all about throwing black people.
So ultimately, the war on drugs is really just a divisive tactic to break up the working class. Because being black in America is a class and identity issue, and they're tied together intrinsically. Because how do you know somebody is a lower class? Well, you look at their skin color, right? That's how it was built. But you can't do that against white people who are on the left. So what other identifying factor do you have to do? Well, you got to do you got to focus in on actions. So to keep us divided and to keep us imprisoned, what do? Well, we'll associate users of certain substances with these people and vilify them so that people, the other workers, will vilify them and reject them and look at them as lower people on the rungs of society. So then they are essentially ostracized by their own people. Meanwhile, in boardrooms across the nation, the same substances are being used on mirrors in boardrooms in our country. They are building snowmen all up and through this country, and yet somehow they're not vilified by society. But the people who are against the wars, the people who are black people in this country, where we're actually trying to get from under the yoke of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining. We're just wanting to have equality and equity. We're also being subject to these type of treatment here in the United States. Let me finish this, and then we can move on. So it says the prison population in the United States in 1970 was 357,292 people. And by 1980, the prison population went up to 513,900. Now, 1980, that was 44 years ago. So you can imagine the population explosion within our carceral system to this today. So I want to share that because this is what was going on with the Nixon administration in the war on drugs, was to suppress those of us, especially who are black, especially people who are working class. Now, another thing that a lot of people did not realize is that at that same time, there was a other nefarious plot that was going on. The other nefarious plot that was happening was the CIA actually selling drugs to people in our neighborhoods, especially in Black neighborhoods. So I'm going to go here, and this is all very true, how the CIA was actually plotting and selling drugs to us.
In the 1980s,
They tried, but it was not really successful because, of course, it's still on the schedule. And wasn't Joe Biden saying that he was thinking about decriminalizing it? How many weeks does Joe Biden have left? Joe Biden has what? 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 6 weeks left as president. He still didn't take it off the schedule. Wasn't Joe Biden also the same one that wrote the 94 crime bill, which also strengthens that war on drugs, that continuously helps the state to incarcerate people for something that's health related rather than crime related? Interesting. Very interesting. Let's continue. Now, I just want to make this point here because, yes, this was continuation with Reagan. The thing is that you got to remember that the 13th Amendment still makes an exception for slavery through incarceration. Go ahead and look up the 13th Amendment. So in order to keep more people to do free labor for these corporations, you need to have them in prison. Well, how do you get people to go into prison? Well, you make something that some people do to be an illegal thing, an illegal substance, right? I wouldn't be surprised if they tried to move to make caffeine illegal. And so because of that, that's how you get more people in prison to work for free, right? But they're in prison. They shouldn't have been doing something illegal. But if you make something that is a health issue illegal, then of course you're going to cast a wide net and grab a whole bunch of people, and then you're going to have them incarcerated in order to make the products that you want them to make without ever having to say, well, I don't want to do this for free. And then it's like, well, if you don't do this for free, then you're going to go into the box. This is basically how it is. It's basically you're either going to be a chattel slave for us or you're going to suffer and be tortured. That's essentially how the system is set up. So that's also part and parcel of what the CIA was doing.
a war. So what the CIA prefers to do is bolster anyone in their target country who already opposes the new way of doing things. These are usually extreme right-wing paramilitary groups who suddenly receive a surprising amount of funding and even weaponry courtesy of the boys over at Langley. Here's a...
So, does this sound familiar to any of you who maybe... Look, baby, I'm telling you right now, it's all connected. I'm gonna use my Jersey accent. It's all connected. Look, and this is why a lot of things that when we want to, for instance, end the war on drugs, when we want to implement more workers owning the means of production, you know why they don't want us to do that? Because then that would end the gravy train that these corporations have. It's all connected, right? This is part of the destabilization that happens where also it increases the amount of undocumented immigrants traveling from these places because they need the gangs in order to keep this system going. And then when the families don't want to do that, guess what? they travel here, sometimes undocumented, sometimes what they call illegally. And then they come here and they get exploited by the same corporations that actually wanted them to do this stuff back in their own home countries too. And so it's all connected, right? Because they're going to get them to process what they need to process in their home countries there, or they're going to come here, get put in through the system, and then have to work and get exploited here at home in this country. It's going to happen either way. Baby. So, by the way, the Contras, one of the people who is tied to them, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on her name. I can't believe I just blanked on her name. I had it in my head. Hang on. Anna Navarro. I had to remember it. Sorry. But Anna Navarro from The View, her parent, I think one of her parents was part of the Contras. This is why she's very anti-socialist, anti-communist, because she's literally raised by Contras. And she speaks of them as if they're, heroes. Meanwhile, oh, gee.
Okay.
And who do you think they sold that to? So that's the basis of why I talk about this. And I'm going to put the link to this video because this video goes on longer. But you guys want to finish watching this, go ahead and I'll put the link in this, right? So this was sold to Black people in our neighborhoods in the United States. Bingo, Jacqueline. Absolutely. This is why we had what we call the crack epidemic. And that epidemic has harmed our families, put hundreds of thousands of especially Black men in prison. This is why the gang activities were so bad in places like New York, New Jersey, Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, Oakland. This is why, because what did we need? What did we do? We funded the drug war. Not we, but the United States funded the drug war covertly, which also funded gang wars, which caused a lot of death and destruction within our own communities. So who's to blame for all the drugs that came to our communities? Richard Nixon, Joe Biden, Reagan, Clinton, like all these people, they're the reasons why it is the way it is. And it's bipartisan. It is not limited to one party or another. So when people talk about, oh my God, Reagan was so bad. Also, who are acolytes of Reagan? Reagan was an acolyte of Nixon. And who learned from them? Clinton, Biden, Obama is basically a slightly to the left acolyte of Reagan. Technically, not really. So let me share this story because I wanted to set that up to show that it wasn't just the CIA that was doing it. It was cops local law enforcement were also selling and creating crack cocaine. All right, get ready for it, folks, because this one was big one. Florida prosecutor seeks to clear records of people charged with buying police-made crack in the 1980s. Boom. It wasn't just the CIA, baby. This is out of Fort Lauderdale. It says a Florida prosecutor says he will seek to vacate as many 2,600 convictions of people who brought crack cocaine manufactured by the Broward County Sheriff's Office for sting operations between 1988 and 1990. The Florida Supreme Court ruled in 1993 that people couldn't be charged in cases where the sheriff's office made the crack cocaine and undercover deputies then sold it to buyers who were arrested and charged. This Broward County State Attorney Harold F. Pryor said Friday that while his office was reviewing old records, prosecutors realized that many people still have criminal charges or convictions on their records because of the sting operation. It is never too late to do the right thing, Pryor said in a statement. First of all, one of my questions is, the mayor, did he not know about this? And also, my question is, if the mayor did know about this, then the mayor should also be prosecuted for allowing the police department to do this. Because if it's local law enforcement, that means the person that's over local law enforcement should also face criminal charges. I don't care. Look, I don't care if it was the CIA. I don't care if there's plausible deniability, but Reagan, Bush Sr., and hell, I'll even put Clinton in there. They all should face criminal charges as well for what the CIA did, because ultimately they are the top of they're the top of the military. And I count intelligence as part of that. So, yeah. And they're the reasons why our communities were ravaged by this. How many family members have we lost because of either them ODing because of their addiction to this drug, or them being put in incarceration instead of in treatment centers and in hospitals to get over their addiction? And then on top of it, I also blame them for the gang activity that came because of it. I also blame them. I blame the people at the top of our government. I blame them for the proliferation of drugs that were done by the disciples, from the Latin Kings, from the Crips, the Bloods. I blame them for all that. I blame them for all of it. All those young people, especially those young brothers that were gunned down because of turf wars. And why there were turf wars? Because one person was selling on their turf versus the other. That's all it is about. And the thing is like it all came up from our government doing what they were doing, trying to make money to do more covert actions in other countries when it comes to destabilizing so that they can get the resources. So when we say that the foreign policy and domestic policy are all connected, this is what we mean. The foreign policy is connected to the domestic policy that ruined our lives. And when people say, oh, we don't really need to learn about domestic policy. Yes, we do, because it literally feeds into one another. Why the hell you think we were in Afghanistan? It was the opium there. And what did the opium contribute to? Well, the OxyContin, the oxycodone, what the Sackler family was doing. here in the United States, contributing to the drugs of the opiate crisis that we have here. That's why. This is why it feeds into one another, right? You don't think that we're not going to have another drug crisis now that what's going on in Syria just happened? Oh, baby. This is why we got to wake up. It's all connected. It goes into one. It shakes hands with one another. Let me continue in this article. Pryor said it's never too late to do the right thing. It is just one example of how the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and early 1990s led to harsh police practices and heavy criminal penalties. Some people may have been convicted of serious felonies because they brought drugs within 1,000 feet, 300 meters of a school. Conviction under that law required that at the time that defendants be sentenced to at least 3 years in prison. That means 3 years ultimately of slave labor. They got a good 3 years of slave labor out of them. Let's continue. Says they were arresting people not for selling, but for purchasing. That's a defense lawyer at Hung. So it says at the time, Hung was a public defender who represented Leon Williams, who appealed led to the state Supreme Court outlawing the practice. They had detention deputies posing as dealers. They would sell it, and these poor people who were addicts were buying it. And they were selling it within 1,000 feet of schools, so penalties would be greater. So ultimately, they were causing an influx on purpose so that they can arrest more people. And remember, private prisons also set up the states so that they had a quota. So the state would have to pay a penalty if the private prisons were below a certain population. If they were, I think it was like below like 90% occupancy. So it actually was because of these private prisons as well that were increasing the amount. Not to mention also the glorification of selling drugs in the streets in order to encourage more people, young people, to do that in order to get more money. So then next thing you know, this is why the rap game changed. This is why you had Diddy talking about, I got money, can't stop, won't stop. Because ultimately, it was a game to get us out more into the streets. So then we'll start doing the sales. So then we'll be doing it closer to schools within 1,000 feet. So then when we get in prison, we'll get at least 3 years of conviction. Then we'll be used as slave labor within the system. And the more people you have addicted to a substance, the more demand goes up. The more demand goes up, the more money you make. Capitalism. Let's continue. It's a feedback loop, man. Says they would sell it, and these poor people were addicts were buying it. This is why they don't want to treat drug addiction as a health problem, because if they treat it as a health problem, then it chokes away the money making, which means it chokes away the money making that's used to destabilize governments outside of our country. This is why they want y'all to continue the system in this cycle. This is why they don't want to legalize it. Because if they legalize it or if they decriminalize it, that means that they're not making no more money. That's why the deep state wants the drug war to continue. That's why the deep state does not. This is why the deep state wants this to happen. And the deep state is ran by corporations. Everybody thinks it's just some cadre of people within the government. No. The government is a tool. The government is a hammer. Who owns the government is the ones who actually run the government are the corporations. They need that. Because they want the destabilization to happen in these countries. Because the sheriff's office said at the time that it began making crack because it didn't have enough of the seized drug to use in its sting operations. And because it didn't have to later test the cocaine content of crack made by sheriff's office chemist. So if they didn't have enough to seize to do a sting operation, that means that there wasn't as many people doing it. So they contributed to the crisis in order to get more people. It says we find that the law enforcement's conduct here was so outrageous as to violate Florida's due process clause. That was from the Florida Supreme Court. It says Pryor said he notified Broward County Sheriff Gregory Tony that Pryor would ask judges to vacate the convictions. Pryor said Tony supports the plan. Some defendants may also be able to seal or expunge the records, the prosecutor said. They need to be expunged because that's not fair, because they basically, that was entrapment. They entrapped them. Says the review will take a considerable amount of time. Pryor said he and his office will contact people whom may be affected. And you got to remember as well, when you have a record, what that does for you when it comes to employment, when it comes to you getting an apartment or a place to live, that affects every single facet of your life. Your arms are tied for the rest of your life. And so then what do? Because you have those convictions on your record. You could have been locked up for a couple of years, 30 years ago. And yet it still shows up on your record. And guess what? It'll show up whenever you try to apply for an apartment or get a loan to start a business, or if you need a job. And so guess what? It also keeps you on a lower rung of society economically. All because they want to do more sting operations. So you had two sets of manipulators. You had the CIA and you had the local police in Broward County that was selling to people in South Florida. And how many more law enforcement officers across this nation were doing the exact same thing? They weren't trying to battle the war on drugs. They were the drug dealers. Now, I will say this. I am of the opinion that I think pretty much all drugs should be legalized. And it should be regulated so that, just like the medications that we have in drugstores are right now. But the issue is that if we were to do that, this would open up for people to be treated medically for drug addiction, just like there is addiction to food, there is addiction to alcohol, right? That's also treated like a medical issue. And if it's treated like a medical issue, then guess what? That chokes the funds that are going to intelligence to destabilize these countries. And it also takes money away from what law enforcement officers make from doing arrests. That means police are not as in the streets as much. That means police actually have to do actual real police work instead of just knocking the heads of people who are doing opiates. Which means that there's no reason for us to really have to fund the police as much as we do. It also decreases the amount of theft that happens, because if people aren't addicted to these substances, then they won't need to steal for these substances, which also decreases the amount for police, which means that police become more obsolete. This is why we talk about ending the war on drugs, because that's a huge amount of what is going on. This also decreases the need for gang activity, which means that our young ones and our neighborhoods are not going to be pushed because they need to make money because of crimes of opportunity and crimes of desperation, because of the poverty that's set in our neighborhoods. See, this is why it's so connected. And this is why I say the system needs to change on a fundamental level. This also means rethinking public safety and taking it away from the institutions that were originally slave catchers. This also is a good reason why reparations for American descendants of slavery is also absolutely necessary too, because these are the same people that once we were freed, because we're not completely free, but once we were freed, they were scrambling to get us back in chains. And this is one of the ways that they did it. And white people were caught in the crossfire. Because of the new laws, they had to tag white people and bring y'all into. This is why some of y'all got records too. Because you got addicted to a substance, and then you also had to serve. You didn't serve as much, but you still served, even though it was a health issue. Why? Because they were trying to hit us. They were trying to get us back in chains. And it's absolutely disgusting what this system has done. So this young lady, or this young person, sums it up so nicely. And so this is originally how I learned about this story. So shout out to this young person. And I just appreciate him.
Do y'all remember that time cops in Broward County used taxpayer money to make crack, yes, crack, in the courthouse, and then sold it to unsuspecting buyers just to have them thrown in jail? It sounds like a story straight out of a crime thriller, but it actually happened, and it left behind a trail of convictions that are now under review. Here's what went down. So in the late 1980s, Broward County Sheriff's Office decided that they just didn't have enough crack cocaine to use in undercover stings. So what was their solution? They set up shop on the 7th floor of the Broward County Courthouse in Fort Lauderdale, where they cooked crack. Using $20,000 worth of seized cocaine, they made crack rocks, packaged them individually, and then sold them to people during sting operations. At the time, those who were involved defended the practice, claiming it was efficient for making arrests and saved time on lab tests. Critics, however, called it outrageous and unethical. Defense attorneys were especially vocal, pointing out the moral issues of cops creating and distributing crack. Come on now. The story even shocked federal officials, with some admitting that they had never heard of such practice before. Let's fast forward to today, and the fallout from the scheme is finally being addressed. Broward County State State Attorney Harold F. Pryor announced that his office is working to vacate as many as 2,600 convictions tied to these particular operations. Many of these convictions involve people who were not selling drugs but buying small amounts, often within 1,000 feet of schools, which carried harsher penalties. The Florida Supreme Court, though, ruled in 1993 that the actions violated the state's due process clause, declaring it unconstitutional to charge people in cases where the drugs were manufactured and sold by police officers. In layman's terms, it's wrong for police departments to make crack and sell it to people in order to lock them up. Duh. Despite the ruling, some of these convictions remain on people's records decades later, affecting their lives in countless ways. Now, Pryor and his team are combing through old cases to right these wrongs. The process will take some time, but the goal is to essentially undo the damage that was caused by these sting operations and allow these individuals to seal or expunge their records. This story is crazy because it shows us how far the government was willing to go to win the war on drugs. Ways for decades, there's been very little change, just lost lives and heartbreak.
So what do you guys think? What do you think about this story? Because it also perpetuated racism and bigoted thinking as well. Think about the loss of father figures, right? As the kids say, the old heads, right? A lot of them were locked up. Think about also being locked up and then having to be subject to the conditions within prison, going through that PTSD, then coming out of prison, never having been treated for that PTSD, never actually been able to heal from being in prison. And then you take whatever has happened to you and you put that also on your community as well. That also is laid on top of us. How do you think that actually affected us? You don't think that the trauma from being locked up also didn't pour on to us as a community? When we say we want reparations for a debt that is owed, I think that the mass incarceration alone is enough to pay us back. Then on top of that, you add things like Jim Crow, which was horrible. We weren't really lynched like that until Jim Crow, until we were freed. And then on top of that, chattel slavery. It is compounded upon compounded upon compounded what we have went through. And it's all because the governments, the corporations didn't want to be undermined by people power.
Thank you so very much for watching my channel, and I deeply appreciate it from the top and bottom of my heart. If you wish to support the channel further, so I can keep bringing you content that is educational and informative, you can become a patron on patreon.com/Jaybefaunt. You can find that link in the pinned comment or in the description below. No matter what you give, you'll be supporting independent media and education that helps make the world better. Thank you so much, and you can watch more of my content here. Mwah. Forehead kisses, and have a beautiful day.